So the battle over the Texas border and its security is getting even more complicated, and this is despite the fact the Supreme Court recently stepped in and issued a 6-3 order. The Fifth Circuit has now issued their own order halting the enforcement of SB 4, and they held hearings this week on whether or not they're going to keep that in place. So let's talk about what is now happening. Now, before we break down what is happening in the state of Texas and this whole border crisis issue, I want to ask you all for a huge favor. I know a lot of you guys watch these videos every single day, and I can actually see in my analytics about 60% of you who watch every single day, watch almost all these videos, are not actually subscribed to the channel. It'd be really cool to push and make a huge push towards getting to 1 million subscribers. That's kind of been a huge goal. Regardless, thank you guys so much for all the support that you guys show. And again, consider subscribing to the channel, because not only does it help the channel to grow, but it helps to signal to the algorithm that this type of content is important and should get out to more people. As I mentioned in the intro, we need to talk about what is now developed after the Supreme Court issued their 6-3 order in the whole Texas border dispute cases. Things are getting even more complicated and more hectic after that Supreme Court order, because now the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals is issuing their own decisions. The Supreme Court in a 6-3 order denied the Biden administration in their request to vacate the Fifth Circuit's administrative stay. That 6-3 Supreme Court order had a lot of people making statements online that the Supreme Court had upheld SB 4, but really that was just a temporary win. Again, what ended up happening after that is the Fifth Circuit got the case back in their hands after that Supreme Court order, and now they're issuing their own decisions. A couple weeks ago, or about a week ago, they issued their own stay on the enforcement of SB 4, so SB 4 cannot be enforced. And then this week on Wednesday, they held oral arguments on whether or not they're going to grant a true preliminary injunction. Texas SB 4 effectively makes it a crime for an individual to violate federal law by crossing into the state of Texas at any location other than a lawful point of entry. This statute also made it a further crime for an illegal individual to re-enter within the U.S. if that person has already been denied admission prior in the U.S. or has been previously removed by, the federal government. And then finally, the law also allows state of Texas judges to issue orders against individuals who have crossed the border, came into the U.S. illegally, crossed within the state of Texas, come into the state of Texas. A court there in Texas could issue an order saying that that person has to return back to the foreign nation where they crossed. Now, this bill, SB 4, was challenged by the Biden administration, and a district court on review issued a preliminary injunction, which effectively prevented Texas from enforcing various parts of SB 4. Texas then appealed that injunction up to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. In response, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals originally issued an administrative stay on that lower court order, which in effect would still allow SB 4 to remain in effect while the appeal was taking place at the Fifth Circuit level. Now, various cases after that were consolidated, and then the cases went up to Supreme Court on an emergency basis, and it went for emergency intervention from the Supreme Court. Well, a couple weeks ago, we got a 6-3 order from the Supreme Court, and it denied the Biden administration's request to vacate that Fifth Circuit administrative stay. So they sided with the state of Texas, and they kept the administrative stay in place, which would allow SB 4 to be enforced. Now, interestingly, like I mentioned, despite the fact the Supreme Court issued that 6-3 order, upholding and keeping the stay in place, what ended up happening that very same day is that the Fifth Circuit merits panel that's reviewing this case then ultimately removed the administrative stay, which effectively halted SB 4, and SB 4 has been halted ever since. And then the Fifth Circuit in that same order stated that the very next day, they would be holding oral arguments on the request for a stay, a true stay order, and then after that, they would also have hearings very quick on a motion for preliminary injunction. So the Fifth Circuit administrative stay that was debated in the Supreme Court and was kept in place by the Supreme Court was later that day removed by the Fifth Circuit. A hearing took place that very next day on a true stay order, and the Fifth Circuit heard arguments on whether or not they should grant a true stay order, and ultimately whether or not they should allow SB 4 to be enforced by the state of Texas. Well, last week we received a 2-1 order from the Fifth Circuit, and it was not good for the state of Texas. The Fifth Circuit merits panel issued a decision, and they denied Texas' request for a stay, and ultimately what that means is that Texas cannot enforce SB 4. The Fifth Circuit will keep the block of SB 4 in place at least until they rule on a preliminary injunction. However, in reality, the outcome of this case is almost kind of predetermined, and one of the dissenting judges on the Fifth Circuit actually reflected that. So what the dissenting judge is signaling here is the fact that since the Fifth Circuit denied the stay, this issue of SB 4 is almost kind of foreclosed. Now, despite that stay order, there was a preliminary injunction hearing that took place this Wednesday. And during these oral arguments on the preliminary injunction, there were some very interesting things that developed. First, what ended up happening is the state of Texas in their section ultimately said that the federal government here is arguing to the court and in their briefs and during the oral arguments that the federal government just simply doesn't have the funds to enforce the federal laws, but still the federal laws preempt this field of law and that the state of Texas cannot engage in this type of conduct. Now, Texas and the representatives simply say all that SB 4 does is actually help the federal government and give them funds and assistance in some way, which is one of the main reasons that the federal government is claiming that they're in this crisis, that they don't have the assistance, that they don't have the proper funding. And Texas is saying, well, hey, all we're doing with SB 4 is giving you that assistance. So why are you suing us? And then there was a section where the state of Texas and their representative actually addressed some of the things that came up during the stay hearing that took place. There were questions by some of the judges where they had concerns about, well, what happens if the state of Texas, arrests someone, prosecutes that individual under SB 4, that individual is then sent to the border or the port of entry. Well, then what happens if the Border Patrol, the federal government decides, hey, we're not going to deport that individual, we're going to let them go. And then Texas comes back into contact with the individual. Will they rearrest them, take them through the process again? And what the state of Texas said is going through SB 4 after those original hearings, asking around in the department, I guess, what they came to the conclusion is no, the state of Texas cannot rearrest that individual. It's kind of a one and done. And maybe that helps some of the judges here who had concerns about this process, had concerns about how this would be enforced. And then there were some questions and answers about, well, what happens if an individual doesn't cross through Texas, but instead crosses through another port of entry or a non-point of entry in a different state, and then ultimately winds up in Texas? What can Texas then do under SB 4 against that individual? And the state of Texas and their representative said, well, under SB 4, we can't do anything because SB 4 is targeted exclusively on someone entering an unlawful point of entry in the state of Texas, on a border of Texas, and coming into Texas. It's not concerned about other states. And then there was discussion about what Texas actually does under SB 4. Texas does not remove anyone on their own. Their law enforcement officers and the state representatives themselves are not actually removing individuals. Instead, they just get an order from the court to return that person to the point of entry. And then they hand off that individual to the U.S. federal government, to Border Patrol or whoever, and then it's on the U.S. federal government to decide what they want to do. So the state of Texas in this section of the preliminary injunction and in these arguments was more focused on answering some of those big questions that were out there, that maybe some of these judges had concerns about. And the hope maybe was to shift some of the narrative so that finally these judges would actually side with the state of Texas. And then there was a section where, of course, the Biden administration, the government's attorney, talked about how the court here on the preliminary injunction, which is a little bit more permanent than the stay order, should just simply follow the same analysis that they issued in the stay order. The Biden administration also pointed to the fact that they claim that some of these district attorneys actually made declarations at the lower court level that Texas would in fact actively remove individuals and watch those individuals be removed from the state of Texas. So they're claiming that there was a little bit more hands-on activity than what is being claimed at the preliminary injunction hearing. And then Judge Oldum, who was the dissenting judge on the stay order, expressed a lot of concerns about what the court here is doing and what the U.S. government is asking for the court to do. He said that the type of relief that the U.S. government got in this specific case was unprecedented, that never before was there a facial full invalidation of a statute that never even went into effect without a cause of action that was expressly identified by Congress. What he is stating here is that the type of relief and the type of win that the federal government got is very concerning. The dissenting judge here, Oldum, has actually pointed to the fact, also in the preliminary injunction hearings, that the U.S. government relying on Supreme Court cases like the Arizona case, which it is relevant for this specific lawsuit here. I'm not going to bore you with all the details of that prior Supreme Court order and decision. But essentially what he was alluding to here is that the federal government is asking the Fifth Circuit to expand upon a decision by the Supreme Court. What is ending up happening in this specific case is that the federal government is getting way more powers than they are actually permitted to have. And so here, this dissenting Judge Oldum is sounding the alarm for everybody that they should be very concerned about what the Fifth Circuit is doing. So the status of the Texas border case right now and this whole lawsuit is that still the stay order is in place. The state of Texas cannot enforce SB 4. There were oral arguments on a preliminary injunction, which is a little bit more of a permanent, halt of SB 4. That was heard this Wednesday, and now we're waiting for the Fifth Circuit to issue their decision, but it's not looking good for the state of Texas. The likelihood is that the two judges that denied the stay order, that went against the state of Texas, they're probably going to go against the state of Texas again on this preliminary injunction, and then we're going to have to see what happens. Will the state of Texas then file an emergency application to the Supreme Court asking for the Supreme Court to remove the preliminary injunction? So if we get any more information, I will let you guys know. Also, if you like this video and you'd like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is to like, comment, and subscribe. All those things help to fuel the algorithm, and it signals to YouTube that you guys see value in these videos and in the Type It 2A news. But as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.